Hello friends, today I want to talk about the best foods to eat during intermittent fasting to get the most benefits with the least amount of hunger and suffering. There are so many benefits to intermittent fasting, and weight loss is probably the number one reason people do it, but in my mind there are much more important reasons, such as lowering blood sugar, reversing diabetes, reducing inflammation, reducing brain fog, heart disease, having less risk of Alzheimer's, Parkinson, risk of cancer, goes down, and we can also improve immune function and we can live longer. Not only that, but we can have more health and more joy during those extra years. So the list can go on and on and on, but whatever the reason you're doing it, whatever the benefit you're getting, it all comes down to two common mechanisms, and the first one is that during the time you're not eating, your insulin goes down. Insulin is released in response to food, so when you don't put food in the body, insulin keeps dropping for the duration. If you do that consistently for weeks and months and years, now you will reduce even stubborn cases of insulin resistance, and you can reverse type 2 diabetes in virtually every case. The second mechanism by which this works is called autophagy. And what is that? Well, during the time that you're fasting, you're not eating, you're not putting resources, you're not putting new resources into the body. The body has to get much better at utilizing the resources that are already there, so the body regulates the crew that goes around recycling. It goes out scavenging, looking for resources, and it gets really good at figuring out what's good, what we want to keep, and what's junk, what do we need to get rid of, and in that process we actually improve our detoxification significantly and our immune system. Also during fasting our growth hormone increases, and it can go up as much as 10-fold or more, and what that does, it improves fat burning, but because the body also gets really good at determining what it needs to keep and what it needs to lose. Protein is really precious, and the body wants the protein for muscles and enzymes and hormones, so when you don't put protein into the body, it makes sure that it uses the protein effectively and it burns fat for energy. A lot of people, when they hear fasting, they think of long-term fasting. They think days or weeks without food, and that's not a bad thing to do. You could go 3 days, 5 days a week, 10 days, and do that every 2 to 3 months, a couple of times a year, because what that will do is it will create very high levels of autophagy. You can reverse a lot of disease conditions. With that, the problem is that it's not sustainable as a lifestyle. It's not something you do all the time, and this video is about the best foods for intermittent fasting. So we're talking about a lifestyle. Intermittent fasting is where you can eat on a regular period and fast on a regular period. So you might be eating once a day, maybe eat for 4 hours or 6 hours, maybe every day, maybe every other day, whatever gets you to your goals. And when we do it this way, it's sustainable. We can do this all the time. We can do this every week, year after year. So the foods we're looking for are the ones with the most nutrition that maximize our satiety, our fullness, and set us up for success and reduce the suffering during the fasting period. And while intermittent fasting can never get the massive levels of autophagy that long-term fasting will, we can still get some autophagy on a regular basis, and that's kind of the whole point, that if we can do it all the time and we can get just a little bit, that's still very valuable. Some people say that carbs are not a problem with intermittent fasting, and they keep eating pizza and pasta and bread, and as long as they keep a fasting period they're doing great. Well, that could work for some people, and for others it will be a disaster. But here's why I think that low carb is way better if you're trying to go from a high insulin level to a low insulin level. Let's say from this point to this point it's going to take a certain amount of time for that insulin to drop, where you can reverse insulin resistance and get into autophagy, but how long it takes depends on how high your insulin is. When you start, if you eat every meal with high carb, you're going to jack up that insulin, so you kind of have a backlog to compensate for each time you go into fasting. When you eat things with refined carbs like sugar and bread and pasta and starches, you trigger a lot of insulin. When you eat protein, you trigger some, and when you eat fat, you hardly trigger any insulin at all. And protein is very sensitive depending on how much of it you eat, because if you eat a lot of it, the body says here's an abundance, we can turn some of this into fuel so the protein becomes glucose and triggers insulin, whereas if you eat smaller amounts of protein now the body is not going to turn that into fuel and then it triggers much less insulin. But let's say that you eat a low-carb diet now. Every time that you start fasting you're going to start off from a much lower insulin level. It's like you've got a head start, you've given yourself a huge advantage. Not only are you going to get to that low point much faster, but because you get there faster, you're going to spend a longer time in autophagy and you're going to reach a much deeper level of autophagy. The other thing that carbs do is they trigger hunger and cravings. If you eat mostly fat and protein and fiber whole foods, no processed, no sugar, then your glucose levels and your insulin levels are going to stay in a very narrow range. If you start eating sugar and starch and processed foods your blood sugar starts spiking. And whenever it's really high your body makes a lot of insulin. The insulin pushes the blood sugar down quickly. So now you have peaks and valleys, and anytime it's low, then it's called reactive hypoglycemia, and now you get lethargic, you get tired, you get headaches, and most importantly you get massive hunger and cravings. Carbs create unstable blood sugar, but not only that, some of these carbs have drug-like effects. Like sugar, wheat, and refined carbs, they actually stimulate opiate receptors, pleasure receptors in the brain. So not only are you trying to go without food for a while, but you're trying to overcome an addiction. Not an easy thing to do. So one more reason that going low carb will make it much easier, and it will reduce hunger and cravings and make you suffer much less. Now let's talk about the only thing that makes this a little tricky, which is that satiety and insulin is very straightforward. If we want to get full, we eat protein with fat. Like fatty meats we add fat to it. We eat things with fiber and we get very full. Insulin is the same, 3 factors in a slightly different order. To get full we can eat tons of protein. To control insulin we can eat protein, but it needs to be moderate. However, with autophagy it's very sensitive to protein. Even very small amounts of protein will shut off autophagy because it's the lack of protein that makes the body get really good at recycling those resources. A lot of research has been done around fasting mimicking diet, and they have found that if you keep your protein under 18 grams per day then you still maintain most of the benefits of fasting. So I know 18 grams is hardly anything and you can't do that for very long, but stay with me. And we're going to come back to that and see how we can use that to our advantage. So protein becomes kind of the balancing factor between these benefits. On the one hand, satiety and insulin, which is pretty simple, and if we also want to get some autophagy, so animal foods like fatty fish, grass-fed meat, and eggs, they are the most filling. You can have these as a meal in themselves, and they're very satisfying. They're low to moderate in the insulin response. Unless you eat a lot of it, they're moderate to high protein, however, so they're not going to be the best for autophagy. We can't have hardly any of these until we shut off the autophagy. Fatty nuts are a little bit better, like macadamia nuts and pecans are the best ones, especially raw. They're quite filling, not as much as animal meats, but pretty good. They're low carb, low protein, they are very high fat, high fiber, and they have a very low insulin response, so you can't eat tons of them because the toffee is sensitive to both the amount of calories and protein. But you could have some of this and still sort of stay in that autophagy zone. Other foods you can use are leafy greens, cabbage, non-starchy vegetables like cauliflower, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, etc. They're very low carb, very low protein, very low fat. They're hardly going to trigger any nutrient sensors or insulin. They're also high fiber, and even though they provide a certain volume through the fiber and they don't trigger insulin, you don't get very full. It is hard for most people to eat enough of just this to get full. However, if you combine it with fat, if you put some butter and olive oil on this, then they can be quite filling. Now let's look at the timing and see how we can tweak the benefits a little bit. Let's say that you have dinner at 6 p.m. one day and you eat a large meal with lots of protein and fat and fiber. You're really full, you make it through the night, you skip breakfast, but then you come around noontime and you start getting hungry. Now you've gone 18 hours and you could push through, but you're really feeling Sort of like I really want something to eat and autophagy and these insulin resistance benefits of reversing insulin resistance, they kind of start kicking in really after 12 to 14 hours, so by 18 hours we're really just getting going. Wouldn't it be great if we could get another 6 hours out of it? Then we would like triple the benefits out of this now. If we had a big meal of protein, then we would shut down the process cold, the autophagy goes away, insulin goes up, we broke in the fast. However, if we had something small, just enough to get us through, and that little thing we had was pure fat, or at least very low in protein and very low in sugar, now maybe we could get those extra 6 hours and we could maintain the benefits of autophagy. So if you can go the 24 hours and feel great, then do that. But if you're not feeling so great and you really want something, then this is a trick that can help you get through. So what would you be using then? Well, here's where we bring in our famous Bulletproof Coffee, and all that is, it's black coffee or black tea, and you add some fat to it. It could be butter, it could be MCT oil, could be coconut oil, and what that does, it gives you some nutrients, it gives you some calories, but it has 0 carbs, 0 protein, it's very high fat, almost 0 insulin response, so your body's nutrient sensors don't really react much to it unless you exaggerate it. So in the strictest sense you definitely break your fast, but from a practical standpoint you're still getting most of the benefits of intermittent fasting, and if it helps you get from 18 hours to 24 hours, you have dramatically increased the benefits. We also have different forms of fat, like butter, extra virgin olive oil, coconut oil, lard, etc. They're quite filling, 0 carbs, 0 or trace protein. Like in the case of butter, they're very high fat and almost a 0 insulin response. And while these things are not something that you would eat by themselves necessarily, you could use them for your Bulletproof Coffee, and you can also put them on vegetables. So if you had a salad, for example, instead of the Bulletproof Coffee, then you're not eating enough protein or calories to really get out of that fasting zone. Coconut cream is also great, it's very filling, has all of these benefits that we talked about, and you can use it for your coffee, you can use it as a creamer, coffee, or tea, and I often use it in smoothies, and you can also make some delicious hot chocolate with it. And then we get to nature's perfect food that seems to show up in every list anyone ever does: avocado, because it is quite filling, very low carb, very low protein, moderate fat, high fiber, very low insulin. It meets virtually every one of these criteria, and yet it has a lot of properties of vegetables. It's strictly speaking it's a fruit, but it sort of behaves like a vegetable in many ways, and I call it moderate fat compared to other really fatty foods like nuts, but for plant it is very high fat, and that's why it is more filling, more satisfying in itself than virtually any other plant. I'm not suggesting that this is the perfect list, but I think it's a great list and it's a good place to start. And the reason I set it up like this is that if you understand the principles, if you understand the mechanisms and why these things are on the list, then you can take these and then you can expand it into similar foods, and you can grow your list, and you can find out the things that work best for you, because what's really filling for one person may not be perceived that way by another, because we're all very different. Hope this video is beneficial for you. Thanks for watching. Doctor Online 24/7 by Dr. Sana Bawani.